Hey everybody, we are going to take notes for Chapter 8. We're going to talk about deviance and social control, as well as crime, and a number of other things, and some of the different explanations for these. So go ahead and take the title card down now if you have not already. Let's go ahead and get started. So we talked about deviance in Chapter 2 with culture, but just to reiterate, deviance is violating the norms of a society, and it isn't the act itself that is deviant. And as we talked about, there are acts that can be deviant in context, killing someone, but on the street versus not in context, killing someone for war for the country. So it is really the reaction to the act that makes it deviant. If it's against the norms and people react negatively to that, then that is the case. So, and what's deviant to one group might not be deviant to another. This is kind of the relativity of deviance, which is kind of the major point of this, that maybe in your subculture something is not deviant, but it might be deviant to the culture at large, and that's kind of the key. So we can, and it can apply to different cultures and places. In the United States, it's fairly common to try to make a huge profit and extort people and to exploit others, exploit workers. In some countries, that's illegal. It can be very different on a case-by-case basis as well. So deviance isn't necessarily a negative thing. Sociologists don't mean that the act is bad. It's just against the norms. So I think that's something else to think about too. And people don't necessarily have to even do anything to be deviant. There could be a stigma attached just based on who they are, based on how they look. So deviance doesn't necessarily mean I'm committing this crime. It can be that if someone is blind, it could be deviance if there are places that don't want to make adjustments for that and have things that are accessible. So that's something to keep in mind as well. So norms kind of make social life, they kind of keep the social order. And so the fact that we know what to expect, and that's kind of important. There's a fun kind of story in the book. Let's say you show up to a grocery store. The grocery store says, we're not going to sell you any milk. I know you want milk, but we have too much soda, so you got to buy, cases of pop. And so you go to buy a case of pop, and clerk says, there's a $5 service charge for every 15th customer. You're the 15th, so you have to pay $5 more. So you pay $5 more. On your way out, they lock the doors and say, we're done. We're going to have a party. And they start to blast some music. Everyone starts dancing. Like, oh, you brought soda, thank you. And they take the soda and pass it around. That doesn't happen, right? You don't just show up at the store and get charged more than someone else, or they won't sell you this product that they have available. And dance parties just don't randomly start in stores. So maybe that'd be cool. That's kind of the social order, right? We know what to expect when we go to the grocery store. We know what to expect when we go to another place. And deviance is what kind of undermines that predictability. If we go out to the movies, we drive our car, we go into a parking spot, we go into a movie, pay for our ticket, et cetera, et cetera. If you get carjacked on the way there, the social order is kind of messed up. If your car is gone when you get out of the theater, the social order is messed up. So that's where, deviance can happen. And we've talked about sanctions, but sanctions are important to keep that order, to have negative sanction punishment, or positive sanctions reward people for conforming to those norms. All right, let's go on to the next slide. So what were some explanations for deviance? Sociobiologists generally say that there's some predisposition to juvenile delinquency, low intelligence, things like that can lead to street crime. But that's not necessarily the case, as we'll kind of get into a little bit in these notes. It doesn't always hold up scientifically if there's a genetic predisposition to deviance or to crime. Sociologists will say that it's more the social influence and social place. Psychologists, may point to personality. We talked about personality traits in psychology, but there actually is no real link with personality to deviance or the emergence of crime either. So that's that's kind of the case. And so sociologists kind of believe that social factors outside the person, socialization, subculture, social class, these are the things that point to deviance. So we'll get into a little bit of that coming up. So go and take us down if you have it now. Let's move on to the next slide. Talk about symbolic interactions. So we're going to talk about each perspective of sociology and how they look at deviance. So symbolic interactionists, they believe that our groups kind of lead to differential association, right? By having different groups, we associate conforming or deviating from norms with that group. So it could be a subculture, or it could be a different group that we kind of associate or learn to deviate from or conform to the norms of society. So we might receive mixed messages, right? So things like, joining a gang might cause you to feel like you need to deviate from the norms of society. Joining the Boy Scouts might make you feel like you need to conform. Right? Different groups teach us different things. So your family, your friends, your neighborhood, all these things, all these subcultures, they can, kind of look at that and maybe force you to think about norms in a different way, whether you want to stick to them or deviate. If you grow up in a neighborhood where there's a lot of fighting, then, and if someone disrespects you, you fight them. So you might think that kind of fighting is, is a way to keep your honor, but that could be against the norm of a larger society or a different society. So members of the mafia often intertwine kind of manliness with violence, right? To kill someone is a test of your manhood. So, that can be the case too. And we'll kind of get into that. And then another theory within symbolic interactionists is control theory and labeling theory. Control theory says that we have kind of inner controls and outer controls, right? Things that are influencing us and our internal instincts might change. So, if you went to a friend's to a nightclub, everyone there was super happy, euphoric. Your friend tells you that everyone here is taking ecstasy. Would you like to take some with him or her? You might. What are you going to do? There's external influence for you to do this thing. Maybe internally you don't want to do this thing. How do you make that decision? Is kind of a balance of those, right? What do you decide, and what is your instincts within that? And then we have kind of labeling theory that we get labeled in society, right? I think school is a perfect example of that. People might get labeled nerds or jocks or this or that, whether it's applicable or not. And so then it is: do you conform to that label? Do you maybe make decisions to try to break out of that label? Often happens. And so that can happen too. And people try to neutralize their kind of deflect those norms of society. So they'll deny responsibility, deny that it hurt anyone, deny that there's a victim. They'll condemn the person that's condemning them. They'll appear to some higher loyalty. I had to help this person or do this person. This was helpful. People will justify those kind of things. Some people fall into the label. The chapter uses the outlaw biker gangs as someone that embraces the label that they're given, right? So sometimes those labels end up being what you conform to without even meaning about it. If you're labeled as someone who fails their classes and doesn't behave, then you're probably just going to lean into this and believe that's who you are when that's not true. So something to keep in mind as well. All right, let's move on to functionalist perspective. So the functionalist perspective says, hey, we need deviance. Deviance is necessary for society. So it tells us what our morals are. This is what people unify against deviance. How do we get social change unless someone's breaking the norms? How do we make things better unless we see violations of our norms. So we kind of need it, and that's an interesting perspective. That hey, we need people to break society's norms, or else we don't even really have a society, right? Things can't be that perfect. And so, functionalists use strain theory of how social values kind of produce deviance. And this is Robert Merton, is a sociologist who kind of came up with this. So basically, our society socializes people to a certain cultural goal. That in the United States, for example, the American dream, to have success. You can buy an iPhone, you can have nice things. Everyone should be able to do that, whether you're rich, whether you're poor, whatever money you're born into, wherever you live. Hey, you should be able to buy these material things, and that's what shows success, right? So, what we often see is that this kind of push for success leads you to, I have to achieve this. Then how do I achieve this if I can't, right? If you're born into wealth, you can get those things, then, you're successful, whatever. But how do we do this? So there's kind of 4 different paths that we have, 4 kind of deviant paths to try to hit those cultural goals if you can't achieve those. One is innovators that will achieve them through illegitimate means, right? So a drug dealer would fall under the innovator mode of adaptation. They're doing something that's deviant, but they're still making them a lot of money. They can still afford all those nice things they're supposed to be able to afford, right? It's people that rob people, con artists, that kind of thing. Second path is ritualism, that we kind of have these cultural goals and we feel good about what we're doing. You might lose it. As a teacher, everyone usually starts teaching. I want to help kids. I want to help people, and there's usually a point, where you get burnt out, where you don't feel that same drive to help people, but still doing it, right? So you're kind of following this ritual. You're doing what has to be done because it has to be done, not because you really feel that ideal push anymore. The third is retreatism. So people that kind of reject that cultural goal and stop pursuing it, right? So, I can't have success of how society tells me to. So, I'm just going to go get drunk every night, right? I'm just going to go and not do it. I'm not, I'm not going to go to class anymore. I'm just going to, I'll drop out. I'll fail. It's fine. That's it. And the last one is rebellion, which is saying that not just rejecting the norm, but saying it's corrupt. That's wrong. That's not what we should do. So instead of just retreating into something, rebels will try to give society a new goal. They'll try to kind of revolutionize, replace those cultural goals with something different. Instead of us feeling like we need to have success financially, success is just living day to day. The government should be in charge of this, things like that. That's kind of the functionalist approach. And let me continue on the next slide with kind of crime at large, right? Like I said, the poor still want to socialize that specific lifestyle, even if you don't have the money for that. Buying a PlayStation 5, buying an iPhone. You see in TV and movies, it's a lot of middle class, middle upper class, living lives that we want to live, that we feel like we have to live. And so, there are ways to kind of overcome this, right? Things like education and, that's often a way to overcome this. We'll get into it a little bit later of, what happens with that. But on the other side, there's kind of illegitimate opportunity structure, right? When we have these alternatives, things like gambling or crime, to achieve that success, if you can't get it any other way, that's what we're going to turn to. And, it kind of makes sense, right? And it's why people go to crime. Whereas when, people that are wealthy commit crime too, right? It's called white-collar crime. A lot of times it doesn't have serious consequences. So, there are examples of large corporations, corporate crime, taking money from people, from the poor, stealing money. They get convicted. A lot of times it's low jail time. It's a fine. They're already uber wealthy. That's a problem. There's one example of Firestone tires, as from the text, where they had faulty tires they recalled in Saudi Arabia and Venezuela that had more restrictions. But those tires, they left in the United States because legally they could. About 200 people died because of the faulty tires through car accidents. No one went to jail. No one was punished. That's what happens in that white collar crime world sometimes. We've also seen, the women generally commit less crime than men, which is true. But we've actually seen a sharp increase in almost every crime for women over the last 30 years or so. Things like car theft, burglary, robbery, arson, way up. So as society changes to push for equality for women, we're going to see it on the other end too, on the crime, on the deviance spectrum. So not only is equality usually achieved in kind of those positive aspects, but also in deviance. All right, let's talk about the last perspective theory is conflict theory and their view on deviance. So basically, conflict theory says that there's a different set of rules. And I kind of talked about this a little bit in the last slide for different social classes, that if you're poor, you commit a crime, you go to jail for a long time. And if you're rich, you commit a crime, you don't. You can afford a good lawyer and get out of it. You can settle in court and pay money. There are ways to get out of it, right? And this is something that's come up again and again. It's come up in terms of race. It's come up in terms of socioeconomic class. That there are different sets of rules, and I'll continue to explore this a little bit. But this is, the conflict theory approach. The law is used to oppress, not to fix, not to actually punish, but to keep those people without power kind of powerless. Instead of helping them, we punish them so they can't do this. Once again, this is the conflict theory look at it. So the conflict theory usually focuses on the court system in the United States and says like the criminal justice system is not equal, and it plays into the norms of society to keep those people who don't have power away. We'll get a little more into it at the last slide of the notes and look at some of the statistics. Some we'll get into during this chapter as well. So let me give you an example, right, of kind of that white collar crime, once again, not being punished. Sioux Manufacturing in North Dakota made helmets in the Iraq War and the War on Terror. And to save money, they set their looms to use less Kevlar, use less of the material that deflects bullets and shrapnel than the contract said. Right, so they can kind of under the radar make these a lot thinner and less useful. And some soldiers died because of that. Right, there's an investigation. They were found to be true. You would think, okay, there's one thing a company, it's like soldiers, right? I mean, that's something that we can all get behind, and employees even like doctored records to get around it. No one was put on trial. No one spent a night in jail. The company was fined, and then the government gave them another contract and a little harsher restriction to make sure that they used the correct amount of Kevlar, and then they did. That's it, right? If a soldier who went to the army and was out of poverty, tried to afford school, to try to have a job, committed a crime that caused someone to get killed, they'd be in prison. So that's what conflict theory says. Like these rich companies can get off when they do much worse than people that are doing things individually that are poor. So that's conflict theory. Goes into that kind of Karl Marx mode there. So let's go to the next slide here. Let's talk about the reactions to deviance. And the United States has more prisoners than any other country in the world. And so the kind of question is why. And we see, heavy racial inequalities in prisons. So we'll talk about a little bit more as well. People of color make up about, in the late 2000s, made up about 13% of the U.S. population, and close to half of all prisoners are people of color. So 1 out of every 9 black men aged 20 to 34 has been in jail or in prison. And so we look at this as sociologists, right? And the question is why? That doesn't match up. Those percentages should be kind of equal. If 13% of the population is people of color, that should be about the prison population, and it's not. And so why does that happen? How do you get out of that? And so it's a complex topic to try to address, but something that's important to address. So when sociologists look at kind of factors, right, what lessens the chance of going to jail? 2 things emerge: being married, and having a high school degree, and then even more so the college degree. Most prisoners have never been married, and most high school graduates don't go to jail. So this seems like kind of a way out, kind of interesting. I wouldn't think marriage was a characteristic that would keep people out of jail. But they have responsibilities, and maybe that inner control, right, wins out in that case. So I think it's interesting. So one thing that a lot of states did and cities have done, and some still have, this is in the 80s, usually it's been kind of lessened by now, is that this kind of 3 strikes and you're out. If you commit 3 crimes, you get a heavy punishment, right? And so that's something that's been implemented before. And it makes sense, right? You're like, okay, so you commit 1 crime, you go to jail for a little bit, you get out. So if you keep doing it, punishment should go up. But this wasn't just for murder. This was just for major felonies or crimes. This was for anything. So some of those 3rd strikes were mandatory life sentences or heavy sentences. The problem is when you get people that are just doing small crimes 3 times, you get these punishments that are super inappropriate. So like in Los Angeles in 1998, 27-year-old man stole a pizza, sentenced to 25 years in prison. Sacramento man pretended to be Tiger Woods and went on a $17,000 shopping spree, and was just given the goods, sentenced 200 years in prison, 2001. California in 2008, man wrote a check for $94. He didn't have enough money in his bank account, sentenced 25 years to life in prison. In Utah, 2004, 25-year-old man sold a small bag of marijuana to a police informant. The judge sentenced him to 55 years in prison. The judge said it was just too harsh, but that was the law, and he had no choice. These are what can happen. And so these kind of blanket policies don't look at the individuals, the crimes, the social structure. And then there's a question of prisons themselves, of how should they rehabilitate? So we'll talk about it later, but some countries treat their prisoners very, very differently than the United States, based on societal views and the views of criminals and crime. Something to keep in mind. All right, the last slide is about how do we decline crime, or have we seen it decline? And 2/3 of those that are released from prison are arrested again in the United States, which calls into question that rehabilitation. Is prison here to punish? Is it here to help? That's a question that we have to ask. So, and we see different. Actually, car theft is the most recurring. About 79% of those that are released from prison are rearrested within 3 years. And so then the question is like, is it the crime? Is it the criminal? Or is it the system? And that's a question that we have to, we have to think about. So capital punishment, right? The death penalty, is not applied evenly, right? Some states don't have it, some states do. So geographically speaking, we see a place like Texas ends up having over 50% of the the deaths per the death penalty. So that means it's not equitable. Women are much less likely to be given the death penalty even for the same crime in history as a man. So that's something to look at, and maybe a more humane approach could, rather than just simply jailing deviants, is a way to stop that kind of deviance from happening. Something we'll get into, and I'll probably have you think critically about it. We'll talk about other things as well, things like hate crimes, what happens with mental illness and crime and deviance. Sociology really takes a different approach than psychology on that. So there's some interesting pieces. So we'll get more into it as time goes on. Thank you so much, and be good to go.